What are some unsettling facts about serial killers? Story 1. For me, it has to be the toy box killer. He was the worst one I had ever read or studied about. He would pre-record a tape which the victims would wake up to that would explain what he would do to them. He would torture them with pliers and electrocute them. He also had a mirror that would be above the victims, so they were made to watch what he would do. He drove his first victim home, and months later, police only identified her because of the tattoo on her leg. The toy box killer was only caught because one of his victims managed to escape. She was unclothed and had a chain around her neck. He was by far the sickest person I have studied. Story 2. The Golden State Killer's dad was super abusive to the whole family, a surprise to no one. He divorced GSK's mother and left the country, moved to South Korea and married another woman, and named the children. He had her the exact same names as the kids he had with his first wife. When GSK was attacking couples, he'd take the woman out into the living room and abuse her. He often did it in front of the TV, which would be turned on with a towel or some sort of fabric covering the screen. This was so he could have just enough light to see her and what he was doing without having to actually turn the regular lights on. That would potentially get neighbors' attention. When officers raided his house after he was arrested in 2018, they found his computer screen with a towel hanging over it in the same fashion. Story 3. I am currently doing a minor for psychology, so eventually serial killers will come up eventually due to the high interest in the concept. Probably one of the most interesting things is despite the various motives and styles, that is how they kill, and their style. Majority of the time, they tend to be very prideful. While there are a few exceptions, you will see some of the most infamous serial killers be quite boastful in regards to murdering. However, it is actually a bit more common than what you might think. Police even use this as a way to get people to confess, like the chessboard killer from Russia, who confessed after the officer who was getting him to confess started to praise him about his work, and thus the killer started to brag. In terms of a single interesting fact about an individual killer, Richard Chase, the vampire of Sacramento, who broke into homes, killed the occupants, and drank their blood, only broke into homes where the doors were unlocked because he took it as a sign of invitation, while locked ones meant you were unwelcomed. Definitely adds to the vampire nickname, though. Story 4. It was near Halloween time when my friends and I were telling ghost stories. My friend said she was going to tell a story about her parents' first date. She said she didn't like telling the story, since it was actually true, but we prodded her on. To cut to the chase, the parents had spent a nice, if awkward, first date, and around the time that they would have said goodnight, the male in the situation, my friend's dad, suggested that they go for a midnight hike up Provo Canyon. He apparently knew the place since he had done a fair amount of rock climbing in the area. So the two drove up the mouth of the canyon, got out of their cars and started hiking under just the light of the stars, since it was a new moon. At some point, the male starts getting a bad feeling, since the pathway ahead, which would pass under some trees, would be dark, and because it was getting to be quite late, he ignores the feeling and presses on. In later rehearsings of the story, the female would say that she had felt the same feeling at what was probably the same time, though she didn't know the trail like he did. A minute later, the feeling came back to the male. He ignored it again and started walking a bit of the way into the trees when his foot hit something soft in the middle of the path. Under the trees, it was too dark to see just what this soft thing was, and the feeling came back stronger than ever. Instead of finding out what his foot had bumped into, he and the female both agreed to hightail it out of there. Years later, after being married for some time, they were watching an interview with the serial killer, Ted Bundy. In response to a question asking him to describe the time that he felt the closest to being caught, he explained about the night that he lured a girl into Provo Canyon and had just killed her when he heard some people coming up the trail. He explained how he hid in the trees just in time, only to watch some guy walk right into the body, and for some reason, just turn around and walk away. Story 5. Richard Chase, the vampire of Sacramento, would walk around in a bright orange jacket covered in dried blood all the time. The only reason he didn't get caught sooner was because dried blood is brown, not red. People just thought he was crazy and dirty. Also, bonus fact, Chase once got blood poisoning because he injected rabbit blood directly into his veins. He had Cotard's delusion and thought his body didn't have enough blood in it. Very interesting and terrifying case if you are looking for a new killer to read about. Story 6. Armin Meiwes, the Rotenburg cannibal, a supremely fascinating man who I can answer, like any question about, became a cannibal for multiple reasons, including the fact that when he was a child, he came home from school one day to find that his family had moved houses without him. Eventually, they noticed he was missing and found him crying on the front steps of his house. Because of that event, and others, Meiwes fantasized about eating his brother so that they would never be separated. Meiwes would only accept victims who looked similar to his brother. Blonde, tall, male, etc. He only ever cannibalized one person, and that's an equally fascinating story I would love to tell. But as he was searching for victims, he was meticulous about whether or not they resembled his brother. Story 7. Marcel Petiot was a serial killer who operated during the German occupation of France. He set up a fraudulent escape network in which he, and a few accomplices, charged individuals thousands of francs for passage out of Europe to South America. The accomplices sent the people to Petiot, who, as a doctor, told people they needed vaccines to enter South American countries, and would inject them with cyanide. He dumped many of the bodies in a pit in his basement filled with quicklime. Story 8. Jesse Pomeroy committed several violent assaults against young boys in his Boston neighborhood in 1871 and 1872. He was caught, and, after being released, went on to murder a 10-year-old girl and a 4-year-old boy when he was 14 years old. He was arrested and sent to prison. The authorities eventually decided a 14-year-old was too young to hang, and stayed there until his death in 1932, at age 72. Fun facts. He made numerous attempts to escape from prison. The most notable was undoubtedly taking a wire, digging through the stone walls of his cell until he met and breached the gas line feeding the lamp next to the cell door, then igniting the leaking gas. Blew a huge hole in his cell, and if he hadn't been so dazed from the blast, he would have escaped. He also filed numerous absurd lawsuits and appeals trying to overturn his conviction. The one that provides insight into his inner workings was the one that pointed out that he'd been sentenced for murder with atrocity, that is, with unusual cruelty. However, since he'd first strangled his victims into unconsciousness, he reasoned that there was no way they could have felt pain, and therefore the for atrocity part of his conviction was invalid. Story 9. Nobody knows what actually happened, but the Dyatlov Pass incident is pretty creepy. In 1959, 9 skiers mysteriously died in the Ural Mountains in the USSR. From Wikipedia, during the night, something caused them to tear their way out of their tents and flee the campsite, all while inadequately dressed for the heavy snowfall and sub-zero temperatures. The fatal injuries of the 3 bodies could not have been caused by another human being, because the force of the blows had been too strong and no soft tissue had been damaged. I've also heard that people thought the communist government had killed them for whatever reason, but when Gorbachev instituted glasnost, it was revealed that the authorities of the day did not know what had happened. Story 10. John List lost his job at a bank and was so scared of losing his home and bringing shame and distress to his family that he meticulously planned the murder of his wife, mother, and kids, so that weeks went by before anyone realized they were missing. He then left the bodies in sleeping bags in the ballroom of the family's mansion, cut his face out of all the family photos, and moved away to start a new life and eventually found a new wife. He was caught almost 2 decades later when an age progression clay bust was made of his face and shown on America's Most Wanted. The worst part? The skylight in the family mansion was rumored to be a Tiffany and could have fetched about $100K, solving much if not all of his money troubles. Story 11. All of the profiles, early warning signs, and so on is mostly a lot of unscientific guesswork. While general trends and common characteristics are often accurate, there is no real scientific basis for any of it. There is also the issue that all of that work is based almost entirely on serial killers that have been caught, and to a lesser extent those that have been identified but not caught. And then the bulk of that work is based on interviews with the killers, so the data is probably not all that reliable. And the kicker? Most serial killers are not caught or even identified. As long as they pick low-status victims, runaways, prostitutes, drug addicts, or just plain poor, and dump the bodies where they aren't found or in a jurisdiction without enough personnel or budget, they're going to get away with it almost every time. Back in the 80s, a couple of researchers ended up investigating a serial kill team, extremely rare, where one of them confessed to doing many killings on his own, although it eventually became obvious that he was taking credit for victims he had nothing to do with. This led them to do a statistical analysis of unidentified victims and unsolved murders from the 70s to early 80s. Based on that, they determined that there are anywhere from 110 or so serial killers active at any given time. Most of those will never be caught or identified. Story 12. The old observed connection of serial killers and bedwetters. Being a childhood bedwetter, I can really understand it. Back then, it was heavily stigmatized. Parents would shame you. It was a secret you kept hidden from everyone you knew, and it kept you from interacting normally with people during your developmental years. When you mentally develop in such a way, it really shapes the type of adult you become. I feel as if I have their emotional detachment but lack the negative emotions behind their motivations to do people harm. Because of this, when I hear about serial killers, the first thing I wonder is, what isolated them? Story 13. Well, for starters, their name is Yoshikage Kira. They're 33 years old. Their house is in the northeast section of Moryo, where all the villas are, and they are not married. They work as an employee for the Kamayu department stores and get home every day by 8 p.m. at the latest. They don't smoke, but occasionally drink. They're in bed by 11 p.m. and make sure that they get 8 hours of sleep, no matter what. After having a glass of warm milk and doing about 20 minutes of stretches before going to bed, they usually have no problem sleeping until morning. Just like a baby, They wake up without any fatigue or stress in the morning. They were told there were no issues at their last checkup. They're trying to explain that they are a person who wishes to live a very quiet life. They take care not to trouble themselves with any enemies, like winning and losing, that would cause them to lose sleep at night. That is how they deal with society, and they know that is what brings them happiness. Although, if they were to fight, they wouldn't lose to anyone. Story 14. While there are the canonical 5, meaning the 5 victims that everyone mostly agreed upon that Jack the Ripper killed, there are other victims that seemingly match the MO and could be linked, but there has never been a consensus. Thus, no one knows exactly how many victims there were to Jack the Ripper. Also, while he was never caught, there have been some people who have been conjectured as possible suspects, and some of them seem quite plausible. However, it's most likely that we will never know who he or she was. It's highly speculated, even from his own son, that Dr. George Hodel was responsible for the Black Dahlia murder, as well as possibly other murders where the victims were found in similar positions. BuzzFeed Unsolved has a great piece about this. Story 15. The serial killer Holmes was considered America's first serial killer, and did so by constructing a hotel near a busy area of Chicago, not far from the World's Fair, and used it as a front to lure in and kill victims. Although the hotel section of the building was never completed, the actual building was a convoluted jumble of hallways, windowless rooms, soundproof rooms, doors that can only be opened from the outside, and chutes that went to the basement, which contained large vats of acid for melting flesh, and a crematorium which he used to dispose of remains. The fascinating thing is that with all of the ways he could kill people, the place was basically his own hunting ground, and was only discovered because he cheaped out on construction and didn't pay for the materials, which lead the people who sold him them, searching the building and finding all the horrific death traps. Story 16. Randall Woodfield, known as the I-5 killer, operated on the Interstate 5 corridor in the Pacific Northwest during 1980 and Part 81. He's suspected of killing up to 44 people. Overall, he was just a terrible human being. But before he became the I-5 killer, Woodfield played wide receiver for the Portland State University Vikings football team for 2.5 years, but dropped out to be drafted by the Green Bay Packers in the 1974 NFL Draft. He got cut during training and played in some semi-pro teams instead. He was arrested for some flashing incidents and got cut completely from the NFL before 1974 was over. James Pietragallo and Jimmy Wisman do a great job of covering it in an episode of their Crime and Sports podcast. Cannot recommend it enough. Story 17. I have a family member who briefly dated this guy. She almost but not quite fit the profile of his victims. One time when he picked her up, her adult son was visiting the house, met him, and shook his hand. He ghosted her after that. Also, my mom was living in a mobile home park in Wichita during BTK's killing spree. My dad was deployed overseas. They had a big German shepherd who she would put outside for a little bit every night before going to sleep, and she said for a while she had to bring him in early because he would just go crazy barking, growling, and snarling every night. Shortly after he stopped doing that, there was a BTK murder not too far from the mobile home park. Scary stuff. Some older homes in Wichita have a second landline installed by the door because he was notorious for cutting phone lines. People would come home and check the line by the door, then the other line, just to reassure themselves. Story 18. Mark Brandon Reed, aka Chopper, was a renowned killer in Australia. However, he only targeted dealers and people who made attempts on his life. When he got old, he was told he had liver cancer and had only a few weeks to live. He was asked by the television show 60 Minutes Australia if he wanted one last interview before he died. He accepted. When asked about all the murderers, which he previously claimed as self-defense, not him or he covered them up. He just confessed to all of them, claiming they were never self-defense and he had committed the ones he previously denied. Then he passed away a few weeks later. Went out listing everyone he killed. It shocked everyone. I would suggest looking him up, he's very interesting. Story 19. My grandmother met Ted Bundy on our college campus, and he attempted to get her friend to go off with him. My grandmother said she got a bad vibe from him because he was such a happy person, and she felt like he was forcing the emotion a bit much. Her friend, however, wanted to go with him and was completely blinded by his charm. My grandmother took her friend by the hand and walked away. She said his face changed completely as they did. It's crazy to me that with charm and looks alone, girls were willing to go with him, even after several had gone missing or had been found dead. I have 2 Ted Bundy stories from women I've known. The first is from a former cosmetology instructor of mine. She was sitting in traffic and was aimlessly looking around, bored out of her mind. She made eye contact with a handsome man in another car. He winked at her and made a gesture like he was asking if she wanted to go get a drink. She was recently married, so she shook her head no. She glanced over at him again later and was scared to death when she saw how his face changed. She said she saw pure evil. She saw his face in the newspaper years later and recognized him immediately. The other story is a bit shorter. The sister of a family friend was at a lake or park in the Seattle area with her friends when they were approached by a man with a cast on his arm. He was asking for help loading stuff into his VW. The ladies declined for whatever reason, saving one of their lives. Story 20. In 1985, the Night Stalker was terrorizing LA. I was a young Marine there, and a friend asked if me and another guy would come stay the night since her parents had to go out of town. I thought it was silly. He hadn't hit Orange County, but anything to get out of the barracks. That night, he hit just a few houses down in Mission Viejo. Some kid heard him and alerted his dad, who called the cops. That was the first lead they got. It has always bugged me that I didn't take it seriously at all, and it happened that close. I think we were pretty drunk that night. It was pretty sobering. Story 21. Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was an absolute genius. I wrote a research paper on him for my forensics class. He was a math genius, graduated high school at like 15, went to Harvard, had multiple rewards for his math. He was also part of the government MKUltra experiments. Some people believe that his participation in the project, he didn't know what they were. He was told it was a small social program for geniuses, is why he went insane, moved into the woods, and started mailing people bombs. Dude is a sad case of a genius mind turning evil because of a bad philosophy. He was also part of the government MKUltra experiments. Sounds like you are referring to Henry Murray's abusive psychological experiments at Harvard. Henry Murray had worked for the OSS and had developed psychological testing techniques intended to measure a potential recruit's resistance to interrogation if captured. At Harvard, he did carry out experiments based on that work, and Ted Kaczynski was one of the victims. However, this does not mean that his experiment was in fact part of the MKUltra program. Yes, he carried out abusive, unethical psychological experimentation, and MKUltra was a series of abusive, unethical psychological experiments, but they didn't even come close to having a monopoly on this sort of thing. The ethics of researchers before the 70s were just pretty horrendous, so it can't be totally ruled out, but probably not. But Kaczynski was experimented on by a mad scientist who had worked for American intelligence at one time, so there's that. Story 22. The most recent one I've studied that stuck with me is Gary Ridgway. The guy got away with life in prison by giving away the spots where his victims were buried and made the police take him back to the sites to relive the crimes over again. In court videos, he just sits like a deer in the headlights as families of his victims tell him he'll burn in hell, and other very nasty things, understandably. But the father of one of his victims was hardcore Christian, and he got up to the stand and said, "Despite everything you've heard today, I believe in Jesus Christ's teachings, and he believes in forgiveness, and sir, I forgive you." And it brought the serial killer to tears, to which the judge told him he didn't have a right to fake any form of guilt, which he clearly didn't have. Story 23. Very few serial killers could actually be classified as insane. Insane, outside an informal adjective for mental illness, is a legal condition, not a medical diagnosis. The conditions for one to be insane differ from region to region. But in the United States, it generally applies when one is unable to tell between right and wrong by way of a causal factor of their psychosis. For some districts, a perpetrator losing autonomy because of their illness is factored in, but this is not universal. Insanity does not include personality disorders and, as such, disorders from ASPD, which most serial killers have, to OCPD are not weighed as evidence for an insanity defense. The ultimate conclusion as to whether or not somebody meets the conditions of insanity falls to the court, but the MOs of most killers almost always invalidate them for an insanity label. Story 24. Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, was actually interviewed 9 times during the investigation, but the police discounted him each time because he had the wrong accent. Some hoaxer had sent a number of letters and a recording claiming to be the Ripper, and the police were looking for a guy with a Geordie, Newcastle accent, rather than Sutcliffe's Yorkshire accent. The hoax is believed to have cost 3 more women their lives, because it was only when he confessed to the murders in 1981 that Sutcliffe was finally caught and the recording was proven to be fake. The hoaxer was named John Humble, and he was sentenced to 8 years in prison in 2006 for it.